I'm with Adam Levick from the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, and we're looking at the UK press. Now, Hamas committed the worst atrocity on October the 7th, including rape. But how does the Times respond to this sort of thing?
The Times published probably the worst, the most just reprehensible article in 2024. It was co-written by Catherine Philp and a Tel Aviv-based journalist named Gabrielle Weiniger. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And this was, after pretty much everybody, including the UN, including the US, including the UK, including Israeli women's rights groups, had meticulously documented the systematic use of rape as a weapon of war by Hamas, not just on October 7th, but, after October 7th. And the article didn't quite go full denial, but it was the closest thing to rape denial within a mainstream media outlet that I've seen. I mean, typically the rape denial narrative is promoted by pro-Palestinian extremists, but this is obviously a mainstream outlet that, isn't even usually as bad as outlets like The Guardian or the BBC. But they do, in my experience of monitoring the outlet for a number of years, they allow their journalists freedom to go off on their own diatribes. So Catherine Philp is someone who has shown her visceral hostility to Israel for years. But even more interesting about this hit job, this horrible article, which they can find on our site, Camera UK, the worst thing was that they interviewed a Israeli women's rights group representative, and this woman was interviewed for the article. And after the article was published, she publicly condemned the Times and the co-authors of the piece for misquoting her, for taking her words out of context in order to advance the desired narrative, the narrative being that, questions remain over whether or not Hamas used rape as a weapon of war. So I complained to top editors. And, given that this complaint by, I think the woman's name was Ruth Halpern, and, Ruth publicly complained about the Times article on LinkedIn, like it was a public open letter complaining about the horrible journalism of that piece. And I sent that link from LinkedIn to the Times editor, and they assured me that it would be investigated. To this day, never heard one thing back. The article was never revised or amended. No apology was given to Israeli women who've been raped. Like, it was really probably by far the worst thing that they've published in my memory. And to this day, there's been no apology from anyone at the outlet.
This isn't journalism, really. It's just agenda, isn't it?
Oh, I mean, look, I know less about the co-author Gabrielle Weiniger. I mean, she's Tel Aviv based, and I know less about her. But Catherine Philp, and we have receipts. I mean, if you go to Camera UK and type in Catherine Philp, we have a tag, and you can see that. I mean, she's been openly hostile to Israel since, I don't know, 2013, I think it is. And to allow someone with that kind of agenda to be a Middle East correspondent and, really publish something that was just a horrible piece of journalism motivated by her contempt for Israel and showing such amazing contempt and lack of empathy towards Israeli rape victims, which, as you know, the evidence, if anything, has increased since 2024. And it turns out that, women that were released who were held hostage were sexually assaulted in horrible ways, that men were sexually assaulted. The evidence has only grown since then. And there's been again, like, this is really one of the greatest failures of journalism as it regards Israel in the Times history, going back to at least 2013. And, people on X, people remember that, whenever the Times or Catherine Philp comes up, they mention that, are you going to apologize yet? But there's been no accountability. And I actually wrote a post at Camera UK called Zero Accountability. And I contextualized that rape denial piece, or soft rape denial piece, with another poor piece of journalism by one of the co-authors of that piece, Gabrielle Weiniger. So this really is it really shames the outlet that they never retracted that horrible, horrible article.
And of course, the pro-Palestinian mob will take that article and believe it as truth, and they will spread it on the streets. Oh, Israel are lying, there was no such thing as rape. And then the honest man on the street will listen to that, and he will believe it as well, and the lie just spreads and spreads, doesn't it?
Yeah, I like to refer to it as, I would say that mainstream outlets like The Guardian and sometimes even The Times, what they're doing is laundering extremist views, giving it a mainstream veneer.
Mm.
It's one thing if Electronic Intifada or Palestinian Solidarity Campaign post extremist ideas on social media or on their websites, but by promoting that, these fringe extremist ideas on mainstream platforms, they're really laundering extremist propaganda. And it's really stunning coming from Catherine Philp, who, fancies herself a feminist. And I think this is also like part of a larger pattern. And Israeli women and Jewish women have complained about how, many within the feminist movement abandoned them after October 7th. These are people that in any other circumstance would have been up in arms over Hamas's brutal treatment of women and girls. And instead, they kind of decided that, their hatred of Israel superseded their sympathy towards women and the victims of abuse against women. So I think we have like a perfect storm of just, there's something about this anti-Zionist ideology that is all consuming, that, allows otherwise sober people to really clouds their judgment in a way that's not only harmful to them, but it just, to the degree that they have they have a voice that's widely heard throughout the media. It distorts, the views of readers by exposing them to these extremist ideas under the veneer of mainstream news.
Now we're seeing at the moment that one of the big stories outside of the war that's happening at the moment is the Jeffrey Epstein and his list. People are linking him to Mossad. Is this again a false narrative, trying to blame the Jews for everything that Jeffrey Epstein has been up to?
Oh, absolutely. Look, that's something also that's on the fringes of the conspiracy theory, section online. Some within the new right, some within the traditional radical left, but also the Times also legitimized it. A piece by Gabrielle Weniger a couple weeks ago. She would, again, just to remind your listeners that she was the co-author of that soft rape denial piece that they published in 2024. She wrote an article for the Times that basically asked the question, was Jeffrey Epstein a Mossad agent? Now, first of all, the article was horrible, meaning that there was no actual evidence. The fact that she actually published that shows either that there were no editors involved in the process or that they just didn't care and they wanted clicks. But another interesting thing about it is that the only piece of evidence that Weniger attempted to insert into the article that Epstein was, a Mossad agent was some like one sentence from a long FBI report that cited a unidentified anonymous source as saying that he thought that Epstein was a Mossad agent. Well, a little bit of digging turned out that this man's name was Charles Johnson, I believe, and Johnson is a discredited criminal and someone who promotes Holocaust denial. I mean, look, the FBI has all sorts of sources, right? The fact that one source made this unevidenced claim in a statement to the FBI means absolutely nothing. And the fact that he was a Holocaust denier and someone who was convicted previously of fraud and other crimes showed that A, Weniger, the Times journalist, didn't do due diligence, right? She didn't check to see who this person was. And that she was so insistent on promoting this conspiracy theory, tying Israel to this serial, sex predator, that she just didn't do basic journalism. And even worse, and this is something that, to make things worse, to really show what bad faith Weniger was operating in, she, on X, on Twitter, the next day or maybe 2 days later, she tweeted this photo purportedly showing Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, in a photo with Epstein. The problem was it was clearly an AI fake. In other words, like she tweeted this as supposedly evidence of further Israeli involvement with Epstein when, a couple of clicks on X and a couple of reverse image searches would have told her that this was clearly a fake. And here he is, a journalist, right? The Tel Aviv-based journalist of a mainstream British newspaper promoting on X a conspiracy theory. And not only that, also promoting an AI fake image. Well, it turns out that, she eventually apologized, but that was only after Herzog threatened to sue her. So, I mean, this is really amateurish stuff on top of everything else. I mean, it's amazing that someone can keep their job when engaging in such gross misconduct. But it seems at the times there's really no consequences for those kinds of errors.
Terrible, terrible. We just saw a terrorist attack in Australia on Bondi Beach. How did the Times report on that? Were they good at reporting on that?
There was an article in the Times that we wrote about that's on our site, and which did a very bad job of trying to, let's put it this way. This is one of the problems with coverage of anti-Semitic attacks that are motivated by anti-Zionist extremism, is that very often journalists go out of their way to give the pro-Palestinian movement a pass. So we did write an article about this one piece at the Times. Now the article was 80% of it was fine in that it talked about the anti-Semitic incidents leading up to the Bondi massacre. But then it inserted as a fact that, that people shouldn't conflate pro-Palestine activism with anti-Semitic attacks like the one in Bondi. When in fact, those who have been agitating since October 7th in Australia have been anti-Semitic extremists. That the Bondi massacre was carried out by two ISIS supporters who were anti-Zionist extremists. It attempted essentially to create this bizarre narrative whereby the pro-Palestinian activists who, for instance, on October 8th, the day after the October 7th massacre in Sydney at the Opera House, had this hate march expressing, expressions of support for the Intifada, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, hurling anti-Semitic epithets at Jews. It is very clear to anybody who follows the trail from October 7th, 2023 to the Bondi Beach massacre that these voices that don't try to hide their hatred of Israel and don't try to hide their support for the October 7th massacre, that this has led to the fire bombings of synagogues, of attacks on Jewish homes, Jewish institutions. There's that, there have been some far right-wing attacks, but the journalist of this article tried to basically, give the pro-Palestinian extremist movement impunity, suggesting that they have nothing to do with attacks on Jews, when the overwhelming majority, according to statistics kept by Australian Jewish community leaders, the overwhelming majority of anti-Jewish incidents have been perpetrated by those on the left, and specifically those within the pro-Palestinian left. So what started off to be a decent article, again, there's this disconnect. There's this general inability of mainstream media journalists to wrap their mind around the fact that the anti-Zionist movement is a hate movement, that those who wish for the destruction of Israel are by nature anti-Jewish, and that it results in attacks on Jews. Look at Washington, D.C. Jewish, the attack there by a pro-Palestinian activist that killed two embassy staff outside of the Jewish Museum. Look at the firebombing attack in Colorado that killed an elderly Jew at a pro-hostage rally. Look at what happened in Manchester, right? The Manchester attack. These are all perpetrated by anti-Israel / pro-Palestinian extremists. And to try to convince people that, there's no connection between the two is a really horrible form of gaslighting that we've been experiencing since October 7th.
Now, there was an Israel-Hamas battle around a cemetery. How did The Guardian report on that?
Well, we don't expect anything from The Guardian. I mean, they are by far the worst. They're not as bad as the BBC in terms of their influence, right? The BBC has global influence and a global reach, and people assume because the BBC reports it must be true. So it's different. They're different in terms of influence, but The Guardian is by far the worst Western English language outlet when it comes to their hatred of Israel. But it basically cherry-picked a story about a damage to a Allied war cemetery in Gaza, and essentially erased the fact that the reason for the damage was that there was a Hamas tunnel, built by terrorists right beneath the cemetery that the Israelis blew up during the war, and that of course caused damage to the cemetery, and also that there was a battle at the cemetery, meaning that there was Hamas fighters engaged in battle during the war with Israeli soldiers. But I think 5 or 6 articles they published really hid that, really hid that lead, hid the key fact, like buried deep in the article as just an Israeli claim, and just kept on interviewing people, asking what they why Israel attacked this World War One cemetery, and really trying to rile up their Australian and British audiences by emphasizing the fact that Allied soldiers were killed in World War One and World War Two were buried there. Again, if you read the article closely and then you do a little bit of digging, you see that the reason why the cemetery was damaged was because Hamas exploited it, just like they exploit mosques and homes and hospitals. It was almost as if they were going out of their way, The Guardian, to give Hamas a pass. In fact, in one of the articles, the word Hamas was, I think, was only used once in an article putatively about, a battle between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So, these are the kind of things that incite people who already hate Israel. And I want to be very clear, because I don't, ultimately the people that engage in anti-Semitic violence, they're the ones responsible for it. But there's no question that media outlets like The Guardian play a part in fueling anti-Semitic views that sometimes result in violence. And I think they need to be held accountable for that. They really are. Since October 7th, they've even gotten worse. And I didn't think that was possible on October 6th.
How does The Guardian treat Hamas when it comes to the war in Gaza? Do they report about Hamas fairly?
No, look, they've disappeared Hamas. The answer to your question is that effectively Hamas doesn't exist. Nothing they do matters. They've been erased from Gaza. Everything that happens is reported in terms of what Israel does. Hamas, has since October 7th not been the focus of much reporting in most media outlets, but especially at The Guardian. It seems they go out of their way to pretend as if Israel is fighting themselves, or Israel is fighting Gaza civilians. There are never any fighters, according to their reports. There's never any attacks by Hamas, never tunnels that Israel finds, which, spans the length of the London Tube, are never reported. They become ghosts, right? So if you're reading media outlets and all you see is Israeli attacks, and then you see the resulting casualties, and invariably the reports are laden with focused on the number of civilians or supposed civilians killed, and you never see any, much reporting about what Hamas does, their decisions they made, the decisions they made on October 7th, the decisions they've made over the past 2.5 years to not surrender, despite the horrible impact the war has had on their civilians. They just are not an entity. They're not a focus of most mainstream media reporting, and that's particularly true with The Guardian.
Israel is actually currently at war at the moment with Iran. We're going through the war right at the moment, at this time. Are you already seeing sloppy reporting from what's happening with that?
Yeah, in fact, I think I would direct your viewers, and I think maybe to our website. We published a piece this morning about a article about the war by Jeremy Bowen. Jeremy Bowen, of course, is one of the worst, one of the worst and serial violators of BBC standards, who seems to enjoy something of impunity at the corporation. Typical tropes about how this war is unjustified, erasing the context of Iranian support for Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, just a one-sided polemic disguised as objective journalism, revealing the BBC's bias. It really is this was kind of like the opening salvo. There wasn't as much reporting over the weekend, but to the most recent report by Bowen, and I'd also recommend your listeners to go to the Jeremy Bowen tag on our website at Camera UK. I mean, I mentioned that Catherine Phillip at the Times is a serial violator of journalistic norms when it comes to reporting about Israel. Well, Jeremy Bowen is also, but he comes with the halo effect of the BBC. So, his voice is heard around the world, right? Phillips isn't. So my colleague Hadar Selah, who focuses on BBC, really has a good piece just showing how shoddy his reporting was about the war, and how clearly he's inserting his own personal views into the story, and coming away with a predictably anti-Israel and really anti-US conclusion, completely detextualizing the war from Iranian support for their axis of resistance, completely erasing Iranians' illegal enrichment of nuclear of uranium to unacceptable levels, according to monitors. Just a one-sided piece that, again shows that there's very little accountability at the BBC when it comes to seasoned journalists like Jeremy Bowen.
Is all of this just anti-Israel reporting, anti-Semitism, or is it just sloppy journalism?
Look, I think that it depends on the journalist. I mean, I'm not going to, say that there's no anti-Semitism motivating some of this coverage, but I think it's just more a anti-Israel inclination. They think that they think the Palestinians are on the right side of the history, that they think that Israel is on the wrong side of history, based partly on their embrace of really radical ideologies that started off decades ago at universities, whether you want to call it post-colonialism, postmodernism, that they really think that the world is neatly divided into oppressor and oppressed. And once you accept this view, you almost have to accept the fact that, the more powerful party is typically the guilty one, whether it be the U.S. or Israel, right? I mean, Israel does have a powerful army, but I think it's such a facile and such a disrupting idea that prevents you from understanding that these terrorist groups in the Middle East and these hostile regimes such as Iran represent the biggest threats to the region. They are by far, the biggest threats to democracy. They're the biggest threats to the very liberal values that these journalists purport to promote. So, while I do think, like I said, anti-Semitism plays a factor, I think it's more of this ideological orientation where they see themselves also as activists, right? And they think their job is to promote or to defend Palestinians, not to report the news accurately. And, this kind of visceral hostility to Israel just bleeds into the reporting. I've often said that if you would have told me, Paul, on October 6th, 2023, what was going to happen on October 7th, 2023. And then you would have asked me, well, do you think that the coverage in the mainstream media towards Israel would change for the better? I would have said yes. Even I was shocked on October 8th and October 9th and October 10th by the degree to which the mainstream media in the UK and elsewhere immediately pivoted from the worst anti-Semitic massacre since the Holocaust to Israel's quote-unquote disproportionate attack. And that's not normal. I want to emphasize this just by basic morality, by basic standards of journalism, that there was a horrible moral abdication by media outlets in just failing to reassess, failing to have one of those introspective aha moments where normal people would say, well, maybe our pro-Palestine advocacy over the years has been wrong. Like, look what they did. Look at their astonishing barbarism in their rape, their mutilation, their torture, their murder of children on October 7th. That it was, just this orgy of violence. And instead of taking the sides of the victims, they decided to just double down on their support for the Palestinians. So I think, as an Israeli, as someone who works for camera, I'm still shocked and appalled and find it just unforgivable. The just stubbornness, the insistence upon promoting the narrative at all costs, despite what happened on October 7th. And I think mainstream media outlets just need some really radical reform. There is just fundamentally there's a moral corruption at the core of most of these outlets, and more The Guardian than elsewhere. But it's infected coverage at the BBC, at Sky News, at Channel 4. And I think, it's such a disservice to the public who are getting fed ideological crusades that's being paraded around as journalism. And I think the impact for society at large can't be understated.
So Israel is at war with Iran at this very moment. So I imagine you'll be very, very busy sorting out all the lies from the truth. What is your website address for people who'd like to know more about what has been narrated by the journalists and what is false and what is true?
Okay, well, the main camera website is camera.org. All right. But if they're interested in just UK content, it's camera-uk.org. So again, that's camera, CAMERA-UK.org. And, we publish at least once a day at Camera UK. Also, for those of your listeners who are on X, we're very active on X. You can find us there. And we're also Camera That Is on Instagram, on Facebook, and on LinkedIn. So we're very active on social media. So whichever social media sites your listeners are most active on, very often the battle, the cognitive warfare that we fight. Obviously, the longer pieces are on our website, but we're very active on X because that's where a lot of people get their news. We're very active on Instagram because that's where a lot of young people get their news. So we really over the past year especially have increased our presence, our prominence, and our content on these social media platforms. So I really strongly advise those who aren't already following us on those platforms to do so.
Great. Well, Adam, thank you very much for sharing today.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Paul.